seas, catastrophic storms.
The main evacuation center in New Orleans is the Superdome.
Epic wildfires. I've watched this slow-motion train wreck, and so have you. And now the question is, can we stop what we started at the dawn of the industrial age before it's too late? To do that, as much as we can, we need to stop burning things. Stop emitting greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, or we will have made our planet a very uncomfortable place to live. But how to avoid that?
It's been accompanied by the greatest increase in human welfare in the history of the earth, but 1/2 degree more and it's curtains. Only a politician could come up with something quite that absurd. When you speak about the climate of the earth, what the hell are you talking about? It had nothing to do with the environmentalism. It was to understand how nature is. Carbon dioxide is a relatively minor greenhouse gas. And you're saying, is there one knob that controls the whole works? Makes no sense. That is belief in magic. And those, quote, tiny differences that we obsess on for good reason are not due to the greenhouse effect. They're due to the transport of heat between the tropics and the high latitudes. Those same things carry heat to the pole. And when you get to the UN and other things, it's politicians that run it. And they've enabled this hysteria. They're frightening children. I don't know what you do. It's an evil movement, and it's causing immense damage. And it is trying to condemn people in Africa and the developing world to perpetual poverty. And you'd have to ask, why would this be a goal? I don't know. And again, going back to the IPCC, the UN's report, they say there is virtually no evidence of a relationship between extreme events and climate change. Now, they say that, but the politics, so they say something else. I have my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. For example, I mean, in the U.S., our current budget is, showing trillions of dollars for climate change. Well, whether you think it makes sense or not doesn't matter. Somebody's going to get those trillions of dollars, and they have a real interest. They're not renewable. They involve slave labor. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? You have material usage, you have destruction of landscapes. It's as though the environmental movement has decided to commit suicide and go in for things that destroy the environment. You're killing birds, you're destroying the environment of lifetimes of 10, 20 years, you don't know how to dispose of them. Now, this has nothing to do with the environment. It's a power play. Let's say somebody came up with a good device. They could get rid of about 60, 70% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What would be the result? The result would be we'd all be dead. Global cooling wasn't panning out. I think from the beginning of Earth Day, it was obvious you wanted to control the energy sector. At first, it was sort of amateurish, acid rain, global cooling. And then, someone realized, no matter how clean you made energy, it would still produce CO2, so let's go after that. You'll never get rid of that without getting rid of fossil fuels. The Earth on fire, with the claim beneath it, all scientists agree. No scientists were asked. This is the way you convince the public. The public is pretty illiterate when it comes to science. And I think what is often ignored is, I don't think the public feels comfortable about that. So you immediately assure them the scientists all agree, you don't have to worry about it. So what happened? If you look at funding in the U.S. for climate science, between 1989 and 1996, when Clinton-Gore administration came in, it increased by about a factor of 15. You literally created a whole new field, and you knew that the people who were brought in knew that the reason for the funding was this issue. And indeed, if you didn't go along with it, you lost your funding. Sir, my funding ended as soon as I went public.
I had an interview with Professor Guy McPherson, and he sits with a very deep conviction that we are in the midst of abrupt climate change, and that the methane released predominantly by the Arctic Ocean will be the end of humanity by 2026. What's your take on this?
Oh, he's entitled to any science fiction he wishes to produce, but there's no scientific evidence of that. These are scare stories. I think once people realize that the public is amenable to scare stories, they get carried away.
Incapacitates logic.
No.
So, what, in your view, is the political, economic, and environmental implications of this move towards net zero and green energy and an abandonment of the fossil fuel industry?
Pure malice. Plus profits for a few. And I mean, you look at it, and quite obviously, you have people like Gore and Kerry and so on, making hundreds of millions of dollars, flying around the world, ignoring all the things that they would prohibit ordinary people. I suppose for these people, it's a return to feudalism, where us peasants should know our place and they should have their privilege.
In 2001, you proposed the Iris hypothesis on climate change. What was the premise of this?
Essentially, upper-level clouds in the tropics were acting in such a manner as to oppose the greenhouse effect. But it's something called the early faint sun paradox. I don't know if you've ever heard about this, but the sun's output is increasing with time. If you're going back 2.5 billion years, the solar output was appreciably less than it is today. And yet the evidence is the Earth did not freeze over. The Earth maintained a temperature that was very similar to today's. The question is, how could it do that with a 20-30% reduction in radiation? And it turns out that this iris feedback is entirely capable of balancing that change. And so I think that remains a fairly substantial argument for the system being stable. When you got to research, when you increased the funding by a factor of 15, the talent wasn't available. And so you introduced new topics, and one of them was climate impacts. Now, this had nothing to do with understanding the physics of climate. If you were working on cockroaches, and you said, my grant is to study the role of climate on cockroaches, you got funded. So you have all these impacts, climate and obesity, climate and diabetes, climate and this. One wanted a piece of the action. And they all became, quote, climate scientists. Now, it's worth remembering, for instance, in 1990, my department at MIT, no one called themselves a climate scientist. There were good reasons for that. Climate was a very comprehensive thing. I was working on dynamic meteorology. Colleagues were working on oceanography. There were marine geochemists. None of us pretended to comprehensive knowledge of everything about climate. All of a sudden, you have people who know nothing about the physics who are climate scientists because they got a grant to find out whether diabetes was related to climate.
So, I have to laugh.
Catastrophic storms.
At a critical point in our history right now.
Zero carbon by 2050.